Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for inviting me. It's an honor. I've been working at the KRMC, the Knowledge Management Research Center at the University of Toronto, along with my colleague Chun-Wei Chu. I don't know if you know him, but he's got a very good book called The Knowing Organization. Organizations use information to construct meaning, create knowledge, and make decisions. So last year I was working with him as a visiting professor in a project called Beyond the Ba, Managing Enabling Context in Knowledge Organizations. And this is what we're going to be talking about today. So my introduction is a thing I like to remind my PhD and master students about, that when we're discussing about knowledge and information, epistemology really matters. We've been researching KM processes in the last 10 or 12 years. And our results showed us that the management of organizational knowledge is really about managing the context and conditions by which knowledge can be created, shared, and put to use towards the attainment of organizational goals. So our main research results tell us that knowledge cannot be managed. It's just promoted or stimulated through the creation of what Nonaka called Ba, and we call enabling context. So to situate knowledge, we regard knowledge creation as a fragile organizational process, particularly towards the nature of knowledge itself. Knowledge is fluid, dynamic, intangible, tacit, and explicit, embodied in groups and people and individuals, socially constructed and constrained by individual and organizational barriers. So we approach knowledge in our research for the past 10 years through a constructionist approach. So the first thing we discuss with organizations is what is knowledge? What's the nature of knowledge? What are we talking about here? So for us, knowledge is approached through a constructionist perspective, as human cognition is not an act of representation or not just a machine for information processing and logical reasoning. In this perspective, cognition is an act of construction and creation, as well as knowledge is tacit, explicit, and cultural. So we believe that knowledge resides in one's cognition, and as well as in between creative heads with synergetic purposes. So our rationale, it begins with admitting that organizational knowledge creation is generally associated with knowledge management. And KM is a controversial, complex, and multifaceted subject. So in spite of the fact that KM, the term is not yet stable, there's been a growing interest worldwide within the past two decades from academic to practitioners in the management of organizational knowledge and its related topics. So we have reviewed and read different research, such as discussing different topics such as organizational epistemology, knowledge creation processes, knowledge-based views and theories of the firm. And it's funny because Ikehiro Nonaka was always known as a big KM guy, and if you check back on his papers and books, he never wrote about KM. I mean, his last book is named KM, but he was pursuing a knowledge-based view of organizations. So maybe it's a good thing to check it out. And Nonaka first introduced this concept of Ba in 1998, which is a different epistemological view from the West. We can discuss that a little bit later if you wish. We also have the idea of discussing enabling contexts and conditions, knowledge types, knowledge assets, knowledge taxonomies, and knowledge management implementation. So within the past decade, 10 to 12 years, our studies, we took a hard look at knowledge management initiatives of 24 international firms such as 3M, Dow, Xerox, PricewaterhouseCoopers, Siemens, NSN is Nokia Siemens Networks, CTC is Brazil's Sugarcane Technology Center, and British Telecom, Microsoft, and so on. And we also conduct the first qualitative, in-depth study about knowledge management in Brazil. It was done in 2004. And we actually did an in-depth analysis of the three sectors of Brazil's economy. And our sample then contemplated world-class organizations with mature knowledge management processes. one of the criterion for our sample is that the organization had to have KM implemented for more than 6 or 7 years. Okay, so this is the organizations we've been looking at. So you're probably not, aware of all of them, but we looked at Toyota, for example, Siemens, Unilever, Ernst & Young, 3M, among Sony, Xerox, Dow, Novartis, among all, just to try to understand a few different things. So our main research goals was to investigate and analyze the conceptions. So what is knowledge management? That was our first question. Motivations. Why are you doing? Why are you worried about knowledge management? Frameworks and models. What kind of framework do you have to manage knowledge? And can you manage knowledge like other assets? Implementation processes. This is very hard to find in the literature. Papers or theses or dissertations discussing knowledge management implementation. How do you do it? How do you make it work? Practices, tools, and results of KM initiatives in world-class organizations, like I said, with mature KM processes. So within the past decade, we carried out a broad range of mixed methodologies, including qualitative research. So we used the study of multiple cases with incorporated units of analysis. We used different criteria to judge the quality of the research project, such as validity of the external validity and reliability. We always used multiple sources of evidence, like semi-structured interviews, documentary research, and direct and participant observation. And for data analysis, as to qualitative data analysis, we used Myers and Hilberman's model for data reduction, data display, and conclusion drawing verification. I met Sam at the ASIS conference in Pittsburgh. I was presenting a work with Chan Wei, and it was mainly a bibliographic research. So we were using a range of bibliometric tools to carry out citation analysis and content analysis. And I will show you a little bit about that in a minute. So we built displays in the form of conceptual maps and mind maps. And they were really useful for data analysis, especially when we had to identify analytical categories. So, and for quantitative research, many different surveys and web surveys and using different statistics methods and so on. Okay, so we have to review the literature. So since KM became a big issue in Brazil back in 1998 or 97, we had to review the literature and see what is going on out there. And most of the stuff we heard about KM was basically about tools, data mining, best practices, databases, people locator and expertise locator. But we had a question in mind. What is knowledge management? So we used what we call the SAP KM model, which is a review we made of the literature. And we also took a look at the knowledge-based view of organizations, not only Nonaka, but also Grant, Thyssen, Pisano, with the idea of dynamic capabilities, Prahala and Hamel, with the idea of the core competences. And so we use different concepts and try to develop a model to see if that model would be applicable to organizations. So we had a framework, and we wanted to know if that framework would work in organizations. So let me tell you one thing. We found out that the knowledge management models and frameworks they have 4 different axes, 4 different foundations. The first axis is the strategic one, this green one over here. And our question is, all right, so you have a knowledge management process or initiative. So what's your strategy to manage knowledge? So we found out that they have different approaches when it comes to strategy. The second axis is if you do have a strategy, so now you have a problem. You need to take this strategy into action. You have to take this to the operational level of your organization. It's useless to have a strategy if you cannot apply it. But then you have a second issue here. So the second axis is implementation. What problems, what issues are you going to face or have you faced when you're trying to make implementation work? The third X is that you have to provide managerial practices and tools, mainly IT tools. And then we would have four X's that we call results. What kind of results do you expect with your knowledge management process? Are we talking about tangible assets, intangible assets? So for you to have an understanding, we can summarize the idea of strategy using Channel HU's knowing organization model. So the initiatives we found, they begin with the idea of sense making, to make sense of the environment. It has a lot to do with environmental scanning. And here the organizations are prospecting the external environment in search of relevant information about the actors of the environment, such as suppliers, competitors, clients, government, and so on. So they face a big issue here, because after they gather information and they collect data, they use information to reduce uncertainty, but it can also increase uncertainty, so then they have to manage ambiguity. After that process, that information is then put to use to knowledge creation through organizational learning. Here they face two issues: to learn and to unlearn their old habits. But knowledge creation, it has to crystallize somehow in the organization. It's kind of useless to say, well, I have a department or an area to create knowledge. Okay, but how do you use knowledge? So knowledge is crystallized in three different forms: product, a service, or a process. And here we can discuss a little bit about innovation between technology and business models. But knowledge creation is just the potential that organizations have to act. Decision making is now the commitment to act and to implement that knowledge that is defined in the strategic level. Okay, we found many different variations of strategic conceptions. For example, we found simple ones like they won't have sense-making, knowledge creation, decision-making, but knowledge creation, knowledge sharing, knowledge use, for example, in different organizations. Okay, so they have this strategy. They had their strategy. So they have a problem right now. I have to make implementation work. So we asked them, what are the major problems you face when you have to make implementation work? And our first set of studies that we conducted in 2004 and 2006 showed us that the biggest issue they face when they have to make this work was social behavioral. Meaning knowledge is power, information is power, I'm not going to share it. This is how I keep power in my job and so on. But after a while, me and Chang Wei, we found 4 different groups of enabling conditions that can help and are useful for implementation. And we named them cognitive epistemic, information, it has to do with information and communication processes as well, and business managerial, and I'll show you that a little bit later. And finally, we asked the organizations, okay, what kind of tools do you have to manage knowledge? And they gave us different perspectives. So they're using social media, they're using the idea of GBP, Global Best Practices, Ideas Bank, wikis, storytelling, communities of practice, organizational learning initiatives, knowledge happy hours like Siemens, the Nokia Siemens networks, this is space for sharing, and practices of R&D, market research, environmental scanning, and so on. So this framework gave us an idea of what was going on with these organizations.